afternoon and welcome to HireRight's webinar, Drug Testing, State of the Union 2025. We are glad that you could join us today. I'm Ashley Kirchmar, Account Analyst for a Drug and Health Screening business here at HireRight, and I will be your host for this event. HireRight prepared this presentation for informational purposes only and is not intended to be substituted for legal advice. Should you have any legal questions, please direct them to your legal counsel. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. We will not be providing copies of the slides today. However, we will be sending out an email tomorrow with your HRCI and SHRM credit and a link to the recorded session that you can listen to at your own convenience or share with your colleagues. If you're experiencing any audio or visual issues, please refresh the browser window by pressing F5 on your keyboard or let us know through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. After the presentation, we would appreciate getting your feedback. Please take our short survey. Let us know if the session was valuable and if you have any ideas for future topics. HireRight's speaker for today is Dr. Todd Simo, HireRight's Chief Medical Officer and Managing Director of Logistics and Manufacturing. You can review his bio in the speaker folder. Dr. Simo, I'd like to turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Ashley. And, this is probably my favorite webinar of the year because it goes through a lot of data. And I really present that data so you can see, as an aggregate, how the drug screening, world is performing at the lab level, as well as the MRO level, at least through the HireRight clients. So, before I proceed, I really want to, reach out to my industry friends at Quest Diagnostics. Quest Diagnostics being one of the major labs in the drug screening, workplace drug screening arena. They're the one lab that is transparent enough to share their data, with everybody. So I recommend anybody who wants to look at that data. There's something called the Quest Drug Screening Index, and some of this presentation is actually me grabbing that data from Quest and posting it here. So, what are we going to look at? And this is really the kind of hot topics that I cover every year. The first one is, yearly trends. So, what's the lab positive rate that we're seeing, by specimen? How does that compare to the National Survey of Drug Use and Health? And the National Survey of Drug Use and Health is something that the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, puts out annually, where they query tens of thousands of people and ask them questions about, when was the last time you used an illicit drug? And, from a federal perspective, marijuana still is considered an illicit drug and still appears as, one of those things that is reported on in the illicit drug category. But they also ask about, methamphetamine, cocaine, opiates for non-intended medical use, so to speak. So there's a lot of other breakdowns. And then you do a nice breakdown of breaking it down by age demographic primarily. So again, I do have reference to that in this deck. And if someone wants to do a deep dive, again, just merely, search, National Survey of Drug Use and Health, 2024, and you'll get that data yourself. And then, from a client-facing perspective, what the lab reports as positive is less important to you than what your medical review officer reports as positive. So, from a year-over-year perspective, and this goes back to since I've been tracking this data for the last 15 years of being at HireRight, we overturn about 1/3 of all laboratory positives on medical review as an aggregate. And I look at that data, every month, and that's been very consistent. So, but it's the MRO, so to speak, result that you're actually getting as part of your platform report, whether it's through HireRight or some other, third-party administrator in the drug and health screening space. Then I'm going to look once again at, what are the specimens the HireRight clients are using, and compare that to the volume that Quest does. So there will be some comparisons there. Excuse me. THC, so delta-9 THC, the substance otherwise known as marijuana. Again, the regulatory landscape has calmed down, for literally the last, 14 years. It's been a continuing evolving landscape. It seems to have settled down some, but it's always, pertinent to look at, medical marijuana, state decriminalized marijuana, as well as, the landscape by jurisdiction. When can you test for it? When shouldn't you test for it? Where shouldn't you even test for it? For all my friends in the Department of Transportation space, we'll talk about, the status of alternate specimens for DOT testing. So that's both from a oral fluid and hair perspective. Again, this is one area in your screening where I can actually provide you granular data that every time you catch an illicit drug user and remove them from your workforce, either through not hiring, terminating, or rehabilitating. And I really want to, tout rehabilitation. If you have a current employee and you're able to rehabilitate him or her, I really applaud you. And I've done other presentations which shows that return on investment for doing that. But it'll actually show you that by your positive rate, this is how much money you're saving from a risk mitigation perspective. And then the last thing I am going to touch on is some important things to consider for your workplace drug testing program here in 2025. So let's not go on to the, so to speak, positive rates. So, but from, oral fluid just a few years ago performed essentially the same as hair. What Quest Diagnostics has seen, as well as what HireRight has seen over the last few years, is people removing THC from their oral fluid program, and they're actually removing it at a higher rate than they are other specimens. And then you can see the Quest Diagnostics, positive rate, lab positive rate for hair, was a whopping, 15.5%. But you can see that 15.5% actually, matches up to the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, where, 16% of people over the age of 26, and I really use that as, people over the age of 26 are generally in the working pool. 16.5% of them admitted that they used an illicit drug within the last month. So you can see that hair, from a positive perspective, is keeping up with that. Oral fluid used to keep up with it, but due to large percentages of clients removing THC from that test, the lab positive rate has plummeted. So, so here's the self-reported data, for all of the things year over year. So you can see, the Quest positive rate for hair has been in the 12.8% up to 15.5%. And you can see as the, National Survey of Drug Use and Health, it seems like year over year, that's going up by almost a point. 1% more people say they've used the drug, and most of that, again, is being driven by marijuana. So some of that may be, marijuana that's being used in the decriminalized format in a state like Ohio that allows people to use it, in a decriminalized format. Or it may be used, continue to true illicit use, because there was a survey out of Denver shortly after they did their decriminalization for recreational use, and they went to people in Denver and said, hey, where did you get your marijuana? And 60% of those people admitted that they got their marijuana from their drug dealer and not the state dispensary. So again, some of that marijuana use is still driving, it's still being obtained illicitly and still driving, crime in communities. And in fact, Washington had a nice study of who's applied for, or demographically, who's going to the medical, to the decriminalized recreational marijuana shops. And they've captured the data, by age and sex. And the number one category of people, buying marijuana, for recreational use in Washington was women over the age of 65. So from that perspective, that isn't clearly the largest group. The largest group of people that are using are males in their 20s, which shows that, in that perspective, the older people, such as myself, are going to the appropriate means, and some of the younger people are still supporting their small business criminals. But you can see how the specimens compared. Urine has been exceptionally flat, over this period of time. You can see oral fluid was keeping up with hair, but you can see in 2020 and 2023, as clients remove THC from those panels, you can see that the overall positive rate diminished as well. So, what are the specimens that our HireRight's clients are using? The three, so to speak, graphs on the left are, year over year, our transactional volume. So, of those millions of drug screens that have my name on them a year, you can see that, urine dominates the arena in terms of volume. And there really has been a slight downward shift that's been taken up by oral fluid, as some clients have moved from urine to oral fluid. Some of that move may be based upon regulatory changes in California and Washington, which I'll address later. Hair continues as a rounding error to the other specimens. There's hair is a different candidate experience. Hair, I've been a hair testing advocate, particularly in the pre-employment space. But I know a lot of clients, have reservations with it due to some of the inherent, issues with hair that I'll kind of address in the DOT update. And then when we look at Quest's, figures, the big difference is Quest, has a, 3 times the utilization of oral fluid than our clients do, but the hair number remains, really a rounding error to the other two. So now that we talked about, specimen utilization, positive rates at the laboratory compared to, what people are admitting they're using, let's look at the overall year over year MRO verified positive rate. So for this given, screen, really, it was, from urine testing perspective, I just put all the urine tests into one blender, mixed them up. So this is both DOT and non-DOT, and I'll have a bit of a breakout coming up. But you can see, urine as a specimen has remained in an MRO verified positive rate in the lower 2%. Oral fluid, used to be the same as hair, and in some years greater than hair. But you can see over the last, 4 years that it has performed better than urine, almost double of urine. But, it's still not as good as hair. I guess last year the figures were very much the same. But, you're really looking at this that, urine is a test that can be studied for. So, I use a lot of statistics in this presentation, and I have one statistic, and anybody who's been on these calls before know what I'm about to say. But, my statistic is 10 out of 10 people doing an illicit drug know it. And therefore, if they're invited into the process to get a pre-employment drug screen, there's certainly ways that they can study for it. So you can go online, use an internet search engine to put beat the drug test, and you'll literally get tens of millions of sites delivered back to you, all of which have a variety of different things, such as synthetic urine, synthetic urine with a heating element, so you'll be able to deliver a 95-degree yellow fluid that the collector will think is urine. Things that you put in your urine after you urinate to so to speak, metabolize any drug that's in that urine. So, and nearly all of those millions of sites are devoted to beating the urine test, as you would expect. Quest, 80% of their volume is urine, and HireRight, 94% of our volume is urine. So certainly that's going to get the most amount of attention. Now with the advent of DOT, working through, approving it for federal workplace testing, we're now seeing different things pop up in terms of chewing gums and mouthwashes that are used to beat oral fluid tests. There's some shampoos out there intended to beat hair tests. But again, the effectiveness of the so to speak adulterants for oral fluid and hair are not nearly as effective as the ones for urine. Therefore, I've been a big advocate over the last more than 10 years about clients really looking at alternate specimen testing and seeing if that meets their drug-free workplace needs. So, as we're moving along here, there is the, DOT, or excuse me, the THC, Delta-9 THC regulatory testing landscape. And I really, call it Delta-9 THC now because that's what the labs test for. All of these other cannabinoids like Delta-8 THC, CBD, Delta-10, the labs can detect those. Some of the labs, an industry friend, Dr. David Kuntz at CRL, does a lot of behind the scenes data looking at, if it was positive for Delta-9 THC, was Delta-8 present, and was Delta-8 present in a higher capacity than Delta-9. But any of the positives that you receive from HireRight, and I would opine that probably from any third-party administrator, when we say positive for cannabinoids or positive for marijuana, what we're really referencing is this was positive for Delta-9, THC over the screening and confirmation threshold that the labs, tested it under. So from that perspective, I think, Delta-9 THC, i.e. marijuana, is massively not understood. I believe the marijuana lobby did a really, really good job of saying, well, it's just like alcohol, but a lot safer. And, that's a little bit like, two lies and a truth. And the truth is it is much safer when it comes to your ability to overdose on it. From that perspective, I believe I've only seen one case where, marijuana, so to speak, toxicity was the cause of death. Just because it's very hard to reach the lethal dose of the cannabinoids. It's very easy to reach in alcohol. And unfortunately, there are, probably hundreds, if not thousands of deaths of alcohol, so to speak, related, alcohol overdose related fatalities. So it certainly is safer from that perspective. But when you start going to window of detection, or not window of detection, but window of impairment. Alcohol has a dose-dependent impairment that is based upon a blood level. So therefore, if you go out and have, 3 martinis tonight, you're going to be drunk. You shouldn't drive home. And when you grab that cab or car service to go home, when you wake up the next morning, if you've given yourself, enough time, and generally, within about 8 hours, you're back to 000, and therefore alcohol is no longer impairing you. However, the same thing if you go out, and smoke a marijuana cigarette, you're going to feel high. You should also get the same car service or cab service home, but the next morning when you wake up, you're no longer going to feel high. The blood level of THC may be gone. But if I put you in a simulator and challenged you on some psychomotor functions, such as complex skills and tasks, discerning spatial relationships, multiple task tracking, which is noticing everything in your environment, as well as quick decision making, you're still not going to, be able to do those tasks as effectively as before you used marijuana. So that, impairment persists beyond a blood alcohol level. And that impairment persists in a profound way for up to about 36 hours and then diminishes thereafter. But there are some occupational health studies that they show that there's still some residual issues for up to about 1 week. So from that perspective, that makes, THC different. And from a safety sensitive labor perspective, really makes, THC a problem for safety sensitive labor positions because of, all of those skills that I gave, impact driving and manufacturing facilities, direct patient care. I've had multiple orthopedic surgeries here within the last decade. I certainly don't want a surgeon, using marijuana the night before and having problems with spatial discrimination the next morning when I'm in the OR with them. So, these are things that, safer than alcohol, but in multiple others. Plus, there is a bunch of emerging evidence showing it's associated with cancers and respiratory disease and all of the other things that, things like cigarettes cause. So now CBD, and this has kind of calmed down. I would say a couple of years ago, prior to the pandemic, I was on the call with a client, nearly every month talking about, well, our donor says that he uses over-the-counter CBD, and that's the reason for his positive marijuana test. Again, CBD is one of the naturally occurring cannabinoids. CBD is the thing that was alleged to be the pain reliever. Unfortunately, further studies of pure CBD for pain relief showed that the placebo worked as good as the thing. So, and if you all of a sudden look for just delta-9 THC in pain, it's almost the same thing. So to get appropriate pain relief, it's now believed that you need kind of a similar percentage of THC and CBD to generate any kind of pain relief. And again, I'm a medical marijuana advocate. My mother suffered from multiple sclerosis through most of my life. And certainly I think her life, especially at the beginning of her disease, would have been improved by using this. So, I'm all for medical marijuana. I just don't want the pilot and the plane that I'm, flying on tomorrow from Tulsa to Charlotte to have used. So I believe, safety sensitive, companies should have the ability to say, hey, this is a position where I can't take the risk. I think that's consistent with the OSHA, general duty statement of providing a safe workforce. But again, if my mom was the bank teller and was able to do her job, with that, that's a whole different job from a safety sensitive perspective. But, CBD now has a legal drug called Epidiolex, which is, natural CBD that's been purified. It's been approved for seizure disorders, especially, refractory pediatric seizure disorders. But to be very clear, the over-the-counter CBD that you get at the gas station or the airport kiosk or your local, pharmacy, isn't a medication. The FDA explicitly says it's not a medication unless it's Epidiolex. And you can see that, I'm not going to read the FDA statement here, but I'll kind of, the FDA basically says, hey, we're aware that there's people selling this stuff and making claims that aren't part of their, so to speak, packaging, that this is for pain relief. And none of these drugs are FDA approved. So it's not a medication. It isn't a medical supplement. It truly is a plant extract that the label that says this has less than 0.3% THC may not be true. If you extract it, you may be extracting it from a plant that has less than 0.3% THC by weight. But if they're extracting it from the buds of the plant, they're probably extracting a very pure form of delta-9 THC with the CBD. And therefore, what you're using is actually, a illicit drug, or you should be buying it from your marijuana, a state-supported dispensary, and not from the airport kiosk. And again, one study out there that actually David Kuntz had, it had someone using a CBD product, and that they knew that was the only product this person was using, or this cohort of people were using. And it was shown that within about 14 days of them using that product, that they were positive for THC in their urine. that being said, when they actually tested the product, and the product said that it had 0.3% delta 9 THC or less, the product had actually greater than 4% THC. And it wasn't that long ago that 4 to 5% THC was the good stuff that you bought on the street. So again, this was essentially, they were buying a marijuana cigarette from the 1980s, at the local gas station. So again, CBD explicitly is not, or at least over-the-counter CBD, is explicitly not a medical explanation for a positive marijuana, i.e. delta 9 THC result, because it's not a medication, it's not a medical supplement, it's not an FDA-approved anything. So I do encourage clients that within your drug-free workplace program, address this in a policy perspective. And addressing it in a policy perspective can help you, to defend yourself, because you can explicitly say in your drug-free workplace policy, hey, if you use, over-the-counter cannabinoids, you use them at your risk, and if somehow you fail a drug screen for us, the actions will be X, Y, and Z that are consistent with your policy, and that will alleviate some pain at a point, any kind of employment hearing, because those are some things that I've had to testify in this case that really becomes, well, did this client have this as part of their policy? And I always say, I don't know, but, and generally they didn't, which caused them some heartburn in that way. Furthermore, your brain doesn't differentiate where the delta 9 THC came from. So if you're using a 4 or 5% product of delta 9 THC, that's no different, than smoking a marijuana cigarette with that amount, and therefore you're high. And your brain doesn't differentiate, saying, well, the intended use here was just for arthritis. Your brain just sees a level of delta 9 THC and is affected in that manner. So I'm not going to, go through this in bloody detail, but there are 39 states in the District of Columbia that have legalized it for, medical use. If I go back a few years, the majority of states did not require any kind of accommodation. Now the majority of those states do, require you to consider accommodation. And if you're not going to hire the person based upon a positive delta 9 THC test, that you have to have a compelling business reason why you can't hire that person. And, I always use the example of the overhead crane operator in the ammunition plant. It is a very safety sensitive job, but the receptionist in the ammunition plant isn't. So therefore, if you can't just have a statement saying, well, we don't hire anybody that's positive for THC, isn't consistent in those 22 states, that you have to have an accommodation process and say, well, Sally was going to be the overhead crane operator, and she doesn't meet the criteria for that because we can't take the risk of Sally not being able to spatially discriminate and notice everything in her environment. However, Sally is qualified, and we do have an open rec for a bookkeeper, and therefore Sally can be the bookkeeper. That is the type of accommodation that you have to do. Furthermore, if you're part of the federal, workplace, federal drug-free workplace program. So this isn't DOT, this isn't specified, either HHS, Department of Human Health Services, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or any DOT agency, but these are just, government contractors that are part of the, federal drug-free workplace program. You still have to make that accommodation, decision, because the federal drug-free workplace program doesn't tell you what kind of drug screen you need to do. It doesn't even tell you have to drug screen. It just tells you that you have to have a policy and you have to have a certain amount of, reasonable suspicion, identification, things like that. It doesn't tell you that you have to screen. Therefore, you can't say, well, we have a blanket statement that we don't hire anybody that's positive for delta 9 THC, and we're a government contractor. You can't do that unless part of your government contract explicitly says we can't have anybody who's positive for Delta-9 THC. And I've been part of some of those government contractors when I used to work on behalf of some defense contractors, where specifically in the statement of work says, this is the drug screen that you have to do, and these are the prohibited things. But if you're just a general, contractor under the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Program, again, you need to address, in your policy, how you accommodate it, particularly in the 22 states that require accommodation from a medical perspective. So recreational, again, this is something that really blossomed within the last, decade. Again, there's 26 states out there, or 23 states plus the District of Columbia. And you can see that 16 of them don't offer any protections. If you're a recreational user in where I used to live in Virginia, you don't have any employment protections, but you do have employment protections if you're a medical user, or do have the company does have to consider accommodation if you're a medical user. So you have to know what states you're in and what to do. Again, there's 4 states that prohibit, or that permit marijuana testing, but you may not be able to take action on it. And that's, Montana, New Jersey, and such, Washington, D.C., Rhode Island. Again, there's 2 states that prohibit pre-employment marijuana testing, really prohibit marijuana testing in the arena unless it's for reasonable suspicion. That's my home state of Minnesota and my wife's home state of New York. But again, you have to know your jurisdiction, talk to your legal counsel about how do we carve these things together? How do we have an over-the-counter cannabis statement? And you really need to consider these things. Again, here is the remove THC states and jurisdictions. Again, Minnesota, New York, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. In the pre-employment perspective, you shouldn't be testing for THC in any of those states in a pre-employment perspective. And really, you should reserve testing for THC in these 3 or in these 4 jurisdictions. So 2 city states, I'll put, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and 2 states, Minnesota and New York, that, the only panel you should have Delta-9 THC on is your reasonable suspicion panel. So when you have those articulable contemporaneous observations of behavior, appearance, and such that leads you to believe that person may be impaired, the accident that was caused by inattention to detail or not noticing everything in the environment, acting erratically, that's also reasonable suspicion testing, and therefore you can preserve your right to test for THC. But again, in those states and cities, remove it. Consider removing it in Washington, D.C., New Jersey, Montana, and Rhode Island. And I really say, New Jersey and Rhode Island, especially, since their laws are very rigorous in regards to, hey, you just can't take action on it, it's a legal substance here. Montana has a little bit more fluidity in it. But again, I would really consider removing it unless it was a safety sensitive position where you can justify, yes, I needed to do this because this person is the overhead crane operator in the ammunition plant, or the forklift driver in a busy distribution center, or in the manufacturing environment where inattention to detail can cause catastrophic loss to that individual or his or her coworker. And then you do have, as of just over a year ago, California and Washington basically saying if you want to preserve your right to test for Delta-9 THC, you have to, do it with a substance that looks for active THC. So active, drug. Oral fluid is the primary occupational specimen that looks for active drug. So therefore, using oral fluid in Washington and California is where you should go if you want to preserve your right to test for THC. One of our lab partners, LabCorp, of America, has been gracious enough to set up their patient service centers with this. We continue to struggle with outside of that getting collection sites that will collect oral fluid. One of the nice things about oral fluid, it is easily collected by a company representative because it's really the person collecting it by themselves. And that company representative is purely just watching the person do it. But again, if you want to test for THC in Washington and California in a pre-employment perspective, and in many instances, even post-employment, you should really look at oral fluid. And that's kind of the state breakdown. So again, here we go, from a testing perspective, hey, you're using urine or hair, is THC testing allowed? And I really say New York, New Jersey, Minnesota, and Rhode Island, you shouldn't test for it there. I mean, just don't. Because Sally's family is going to make a case that you knew Sally, smoked marijuana, and you knew Sally, could have risk due to the job you put her in, and she's dead because you hired her. So again, not knowing is better than knowing and not being able to take action. The next really breakdown is in those, 46 other states, are they safety sensitive? My recommendation is included in the panel. If they're not safety sensitive, you can certainly include it in the panel, but I would strongly advise, removing it in, Montana, Nevada, in pre-employment instances, in Washington, D.C. Those jurisdictions, for Montana and Washington, D.C., you shouldn't have it on your panel, either, pre-employment or any kind of random, non-reasonable suspicion testing. Nevada, you should remove it in pre-employment. However, Nevada law says that if they're a current employee and they're positive for marijuana, you can take action against it because their Supreme Court said it's not really a lawful substance. So, again, there's a lot of ambiguity out there with some of these states, and I'm trying to break this down in a way that, kind of gives you the easy button. And that's for, urine and hair, because my algorithm is a bit different for oral fluid. And the reason for that is, delta 9 oral fluid impairment window we know is greater than 24 hours. However, oral fluid testing at the lab level, now that DOT has assigned a level in which is the screening level, is at 4 nanograms per milliliter of neat oral fluid. The window of detection there is 16 to about 21 hours. And it's, and that's the difference between an occasional user will be positive for 16 hours. An everyday user will be positive for up to about 21 hours based upon that 4 nanogram window. So therefore, testing with oral fluid, in all the states except, New Jersey, New York, Minnesota, and Rhode Island, has an advantage for you because when that person came in to do their drug test, whether it was pre-employment, they either smoked the night before or smoked on their way into the interview, which leads me to believe they're probably not going to stop once they become an employee. And their kind of nightly smoking of marijuana is impacting their ability to do safety-sensitive labor. And it also is impacting their productivity at work because there's enough data that shows that kind of use causes productivity issue the next day. So, but again, in New Jersey, New York, Minnesota, and Rhode Island, you just shouldn't test for it at all unless it's reasonable suspicion. Again, reasonable suspicion, whether it's those articulable observations, as I talked about before, or the articulable observations are, they had an accident and that accident was caused by a problem that that person did by not following safety rules, acting erratically, making poor decisions. Again, from that perspective, you can use those as those articulable observations, of impairment. So that's oral fluid. So again, I showed you before, the positive rate for oral fluid. Now this is a cut of data, and I want to say this is a cut of data from Q3 in HireRight. So about a third of our specimens, or just over a third of our specimens, didn't have THC in the panel. And you can see that the positive rate in that quarter for the MRO verified positive rate was 3.1%. You can see in that quarter, 2/3 of the specimen did contain THC in it. And you can see that that positive rate was, greater than what we saw in hair, and it was 8.3%. So again, my basic recommendation is to continue with THC in your oral fluid testing unless you're in one of those special states. Urine positive rate, you can see that when you remove THC from the panel, your MRO verified positive rate is 0.4%. And in fact, your refusal to test rate is about the same percentage. So your derogatory rate's close to 1%, but half of them are people trying to game the test. Whereas if you have THC in the panel, you have nearly a 10-fold increase in your MRO verified rate. So DOT update. So from a random perspective, the one thing that is different is PHMSA has increased their, so to speak, the amount of people that need to do a random drug screen from 25 to 50%. All the rest of the agencies have stayed the same. Oral fluid continues to languish. So again, 2020, SAMHSA approved it for their tests, or excuse me, Department of Human Health Services approved it for their testing. After 8 years of SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, saying, wow, this is a really good specimen. DOT in kind approved it in 2023, saying oral fluid is allowed. However, there's no lab, there's no lab that's been approved at this time. There is now a collection device approved. So as of November 2024, the National Lab Accreditation Program approved the Quantasol 2, I believe it's what it's marketed at, collection device for federal testing. So again, there's still no certified labs. We are still waiting for the certified labs. I was expecting by this time there would have been the 2 certified labs, but there's still none of those. However, if you're interested in moving forward with oral fluid and potentially collecting it yourself, you can now, reach out, to the web and find out who may be training in oral fluid in your area. If you are looking at that or want your collection site to potentially do that, there's an industry association called the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association, and DASA, that I know has multiple trainers and trainers out there available. And that could be a resource that you reach out to get training. So hair testing, it's really no news. Hair, is something that, motor carriers have wanted for a long time. There's plenty of data from marquee carriers like J.B. Hunt that shows once we instituted a hair testing program, we have had no post-accident positive results, and that has a huge risk mitigation value for the motor carrier. Unfortunately, even though the Obama administration in his last term, he signed the FAST Act, Fixing America's Surface Transportation. Within that act was a provision that mandated, so to speak, mandated HHS to create a hair testing rule. Well, now we're, 2 presidential terms away from that, starting a 3rd presidential term, with HHS never really propagating a meaningful rule in this direction. The big reason for that, and there's a couple, there is a color bias with hair. And when I say color bias, if you have red hair, you tend to deposit less drug in your hair than if you have black hair. And there's several studies that show, a person uses a unit dose of codeine, and the person with black hair will have more of it than the person with red hair. There's also the issue with, external contamination. And one of the labs that was called to the carpet on this really didn't present it well because they didn't want to provide their proprietary way that they assure external contamination isn't a factor. And there's been some lost lawsuits with people alleging, particularly in the law enforcement space, I'm around cocaine all the time and that's how it got on my hair, that they couldn't rule that out and they've lost those. I'm still an advocate for hair testing. I still think for exceptionally safety sensitive labor, maybe even in the healthcare space, it's a great specimen because those people shouldn't be saying I'm in the environment where cocaine is just all around all the time. But, from that perspective, those are the challenges that HHS just hasn't been able to get around. And that's my opinion. I didn't talk to anybody at HHS, but that's my opinion why no meaningful rule has really been propagated in the hair testing arena. So return on investment. So, I really want to thank President Obama in his first term. He had a deep dive on what illicit drug use costs us as a society. And illicit drug use actually costed us more as a society than our number one killer, which is cardiovascular disease. So, illicit drug use is a big problem for us as a society. When you break it down to the employer level, his administration showed that $81 billion was just lost in terms of productivity. People not showing up to work, primarily. And then when you factor in, things like increased workman compensation costs by 5 times, increased healthcare costs by 3 times, employee turnover, brand protection, that figure swelled up to over $190 billion a year that illicit drug use, impacts employers. The National Institute of Drug Addiction says, well, there's people that are actively using drugs and addicted to drugs, about 10 to 14 million of them in the active workforce. So with some pretty easy math, just with a lot of zeros, I opine that, if you, find someone who's positive, and you remove them through employment, either by termination or rehabilitation, that you're saving your organization $14,000 a year. So that's the number that I really use in this. And this is looking at 2024 data. And again, it's a bit of an eye chart here. But what it really shows you is, oral fluid drug testing with THC gives you the highest return on investment due to the overall positive rate being robust, the cost of the test being, quite small. And, and that's why I've been a big advocate for oral fluid testing. Then you see, non-regulated urine with THC, kind of has the second. And then you can see the other ones, just based upon the HireRight data, are much smaller. But the reality is every one of them does have a return on investment. So, if you decide, hey, based upon our risk mitigation profile, we want to do urine testing without THC because we're a call center, we don't have safety sensitive employees. Well, guess what? You're still ending up saving your organization, money every year. You're still having a return on investment, for 1,000 tests of $16,000. So it is a return on investment. So I don't want to minimize that. But again, when you look at this, potentially oral fluid without THC may be better, because you can see that bar is substantially higher, because oral fluid, is really looking for what's in the blood. And therefore, if a person is using cocaine and they used it, a day and a half before, and they went online and got their adulterant for urine, well, guess what? They're not able to use that in that witnessed oral fluid test. So again, this is just food for thought. And I always say this is your CFO slide to show him or her the value of your drug-free workplace program. And again, whether we're your administrators or someone else, purely use that $14,000 per positive, per derogatory data, and then you can present to your CFO, well, here's the money that my program is saving us every year. So now we're getting into the, most important, considerations for your drug-free workplace program. So this is the Todd Simo view. And, I really say consider adding THC back into your program where permitted. So I've already talked about Minnesota, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and New York, that you shouldn't be part of your pre-employment or post-employment program unless it's reasonable suspicion. I truly believe that safety-sensitive laborers in all of the states that aren't those four, you should test for THC. You certainly will have a better return on investment of your program. The data that shows, well, we can't get a candidate if we test THC is a bit of a hyperbole. You can look at some Quest data and look for areas that, have, so to speak, recreational THC, and you can still see the vast majority of drug screens done there are negative. It does once recreational THC is approved in the state, that state positive rate does increase, driven by THC positives. If a state approves it for medical use, the labs don't see an increase in the positive rate. So, the reality is, but still 90% of the specimens are negative. So you'll be able to find candidates. Again, as I said, THC is impairing. It's impairing with a very long impairment window. There may be some habituation, i.e. some people can normalize the more they use, but even those people that have quote unquote normalized because they use every day still are impaired to a rather high perspective, just not as impaired as so to speak, novice users. THC does have wide acceptance now. We have 60%, according to the last Gallup poll I saw, and I think this is almost 10 years old now, 60% of the US population thought, decriminalizing it, just making it, like alcohol was the right thing to do. I'm purely not against that, and especially if we can cut out the drug dealers from the mix, not against it at all. What I am against is just carte blanche saying, well, you're protected, you can just use it and we can't do anything about it. I think safety sensitive employers should have the right to inherently say, hey, according to our drug-free workplace program, we can't accept the risk, and due to the impairment window and the current testing methodologies, if you're positive, we're not hiring you into the safety sensitive position. I think that is the fair and balanced approach. And actually, that's the approach that a state like Ohio has made, where it offered, says, well, if you want to smoke, you can, but the employers don't have to accommodate you. Then the employers can decide what they want to do and how they want, to slice that, risk mitigation, apple. You got to know your risk tolerance. I talked about the overhead crane operator in the ammunition plant, and I also talked about the call center. So again, if a company comes to me saying, hey, we're a call center, we don't want to test for THC, hey, as long as you know that may impact your productivity, but you're certainly not going to have a catastrophic accident, you're making that decision. Now, if the, forklift drivers shouldn't be tested for THC, again, I'm going to make the recommendation, but ultimately I recommend to you, and as long as you go into your decisions with eyes wide open, I'm there to support the decision that you make. And again, you may want to look at screening your safety sensitive population in a different manner that you do your workforce. So we have a marquee manufacturer that for their, random program in their plant environment, they use oral fluid. They're able to deploy that program and run that program effectively. But for pre-employment, they use urine because, they onboard a lot of people that aren't necessarily in a manufacturing plant, and those people are in, retail centers and such. So from that perspective, looking at your, drug-free workplace program and deciding, hey, we want to test this population different than that population. You can certainly do that as long as you delineate it within your drug-free workplace program and then treat everybody in those separate classes of employment the same way. And again, this is, consider adding back oral fluid. So again, the one on the site that I say not applicable, that's CBD levels, but this was taken from the same research article you can see. And again, when you look at the 40 nanogram per level and 4 nanogram per level, you're looking at a detection window, very small for, 4 nanograms per milliliter, whereas, 40, you have a much longer detection window. But that detection window is still under 24 hours with a known impairment window being greater than 36. Again, I talked about this earlier, have an explicit over-the-counter cannabis policy that you basically say, hey, if you're positive for Delta-9 THC, we as a company, aren't going to accept, your use of over-the-counter cannabinoids as the reason. And the reason for that is it's not a medication, it's not a medical supplement. If you decide to use those, you're using it at your own risk. If your doctor has advised you to use those, please note that your doctor is advising you to use a drug that isn't approved, isn't FDA approved, has no science behind it. In fact, the science coming out of it shows if it is pure CBD, it's not going to help you with pain any more than drinking a glass of water. Have a reasonable suspicion, policy, and then train to that policy. The rate of reported drug use continued to rise. So, it had a point increase year over year. Have a well thought out policy, train to that policy, and then have a plan of executing that policy. I did some training for a very large logistic company that has DOT concerns, but the vast majority of their employees were non-DOT. Well, they trained all of their managers on reasonable suspicion. And they had a very robust reasonable suspicion positive rate. So when they did a reasonable suspicion test, the person was MRO verified positive. So they did identify people in their workplace that were causing issues in their workplace. So again, having that and having, so to speak, that in there helps, you as a company deter drug use. Because, I just showed you your positive rate generates a return on investment. But the most powerful drug screen you ever do is the one you never collect. The one that within your recruiting page, you say, we support a drug-free workplace program and we have X, Y, and Z in place to assure that we maintain safety for our associates, for you and, your associates. This is a safety program. And therefore the person, that 10 out of 10 people doing illicit drugs, they may not want to be employed by you. And that's the most effective drug screen because they've moved somewhere else. So again, have that reasonable suspicion policy and have an execution plan such as a worksheet or something else that you can leverage universally. So you're treating everybody the same and all your management is made aware of the behaviors, appearance, speech, and body odor that trigger that test. Again, in the last, couple minutes here, consider point of collection testing. Oral fluid is gaining some popularity. We do have a great solution in place with a partner called Premier Biotech, which allows, the donor to collect his or her own specimen. And the collector is there just to, use a digital chain of custody and actually a cell phone application called QT scan or OT scan, actually reads the device and digitizes the results. So it's a pretty slick solution. And, if you're interested in that, just, please reach out to your account manager or our client engagement team. Again, urine point of collection testing, a lot of people don't like it because how many safety or HR people want to look at someone's urine? But, our partner, through eScreen has an automated solution that's deployed at a clinic level that allows you to get results, very rapidly. So you're able to make that decision within the day of collection of whether, that person has passed their drug test or not. So those are two things that, if you're looking at how do I, get speed to hire as a critical measure, and the drug screen may be that last domino to fall, looking at point of collection testing is very worthwhile. If you submit any questions, I'll be happy within the next week to answer those and get them back to our marketing team to disperse to you. Ashley, I'll lead it over to you for your closeout.
Thank you, Dr. Simo. And Dr. Simo, you did say that all questions be answered by email, correct?
Well, apparently Ashley's having audio issues. If anybody's on the phone here, please fill out the survey. Tell me if I did well or tell me if I missed the mark altogether. If you do have recommendations on further, I'd really like to see those because these webinars are for you. They're certainly not for me. Next part is you will be receiving your SHRM credit or your whatever other credit through the email within the next day, along with a link to the audio of this presentation. Once again, I want to thank you for attending and have a great day.